Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Stories for Healing. As you know by now, this is something that we're doing every weekday, having stories told to us by wonderful storytellers about healing and reconciliation, about transformation and growth. This started at the end of October as I was wondering how could I navigate all the antipathy and divisiveness and just plain stress that we were all feeling. And of course, being a storyteller, the answer was obvious: tell some stories. But not just me, and not just my own stories, but gathering storytellers, which has now become a round the world project. We have so many storytellers coming from so many places. We have weeks of storytellers lined up waiting to have their chance to tell a story. And I'll say this: it is healing for us as well as for all of those who listen. So this is our chance to do our little bit of healing for the world and also for ourselves. Today, we're very fortunate. We have a special guest, Marilyn McPhie, who is coming to us from as we say in this country, the left coast. Marilyn is in San Diego, and Marilyn has a story for us. Please, Marilyn, tell us a story.
Thank you, Jim. I've been enjoying watching these stories, and I'm very happy to contribute one of my own. It was 1918. There was a world war. There was a flu epidemic. But the main thing that was on the mind of George Goetz was his beets. George was a beet farmer, as were most of his neighbors. It was a good cash crop. There was a sugar factory not far from his farm. And the money that he got from his beets was enough to provide for his large family. And he did have a large family. Well, it had been even larger. George and his wife had had 14 children, but half of them had died in infancy. But in 1918, of the remaining children, 2 were grown and gone with families of their own, living in Ogden, about 65 miles away. And 2 of his sons were in the army. And that just left the youngest son, Franz, to help George on the farm. And in that year, the winter came early, and the beets froze in the ground. It took George and Franz a whole day of work, prying each individual beet out of the ground to get most of a wagon load to take to the sugar factory. It was hard work, backbreaking, but what else could they do? And then everything changed. George got a phone call. It was from his son in Ogden, saying that Charles's son, Kenneth, who was 8, had contracted the flu, and after just a couple of days of suffering, had died in his father's arms. Would it be possible for George to drive up to Ogden and bring the body back for burial in the family plot in the cemetery in Lehigh? Of course. George put aside his harvest, and he and Franz got into their Chevrolet touring car, the one with the curtained windows. They drove the 65 miles to Ogden. And there they found Charles bending over the body of his son, weeping. He was so grateful that his father could come up and get the body and take it back for burial in the family plot. But he said, "Father, I feel certain that it won't be long before you'll be coming back for me." And so George and Franz took Kenneth's body back to Lehigh. They built a simple pine coffin. They dug a grave by themselves. Most of the people were afraid of the flu, and so nobody gathered then. And then they had a short service, just attended by a few family members, and went home. But not long after they got home, they got another phone call. And as Charles had predicted, he had passed away. And so George and Franz went to pick up another body, build another coffin, dig another grave, have another service, and then go home. But the next day, another phone call came. And this time it was Elaine. Elaine was 9. So they got in the car again, drove the 65 miles. And there they found the mother of the family, Juliet, bending over the bed of her young daughter, begging the Lord not to take her too. So they brought back Elaine, another grave, another coffin, another service, and another day, another sad phone call. It was Vesta. Another coffin, another grave, another service. At home that night, George was afraid of another phone call. But a call didn't come that night. And the next morning, there was no phone call. And so after breakfast, George looked at France and he said, well, France, we better get out to the beet field and see what can be saved. So they hitched up 4 horses to their big red beet wagon, and they headed off to the field down Saratoga Road. As they went down that road, they encountered a stream of wagons driven by their neighbors who were also beet farmers. And their neighbors' wagons seemed to be piled high with harvested beets. And as they passed one wagon after another, there were 19 or 20 in all. The neighbors all greeted George with a wave and a message of sympathy. Hiya, George. So sorry, George. Tough break, George. And the last wagon that passed, it was driven by the town joker. His name was Jasper Rolfe, freckle-faced kid. He waved with a smile. He said, well, that's all of them, George. George waved back. And then he turned to his son, France, and said, I'm happy for them. I sure wish it were all of ours. And they continued down the road. They got to the field, 10 acres of beets. France jumped down from his seat on the wagon and opened up the gate. And George drove the beet wagon into the field. And then he stopped. And he looked at his field from left to right, from right to left. Not a beet in sight. There was just a big pile of beet tops up by the fence. And then suddenly it dawned on George. All those wagons, all those beets, they weren't his neighbor's beets. They were his neighbor's and his neighbor's wagons, but the beets were his, harvested for him by his neighbors. And then George Goetz, more than 6 feet tall, a strong, sturdy, rugged man, sat down on that pile of beet tops and wept and wept and wept. And then he turned his eyes heavenward and he said, thank you, Lord. Thank you for good neighbors. And that is the story of George Goetz and the beets.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, what a powerful story. What a powerful story. And how much the value of neighbors in that time.
It's true.
Yeah.
I have good neighbors, and I hope you do too. I hope everyone has good neighbors. They can make all the difference.
They can. And, you know, it does seem, I would say, even amongst these terribly divided times, we know that locally, when there's a problem, people come out from across whatever divides and help each other. Maybe there's some real hope in there for all of us as we move forward. Thank you.
Well, I'd heard that story many, many times, but it was just recently that it occurred to me the connection between the flu epidemic of 1918 and what we're experiencing now.
Yeah.
I thought, people have been through these hard times before.
Yeah.
And how did they get through it?
Yeah.
Well, there was plenty of tragedy and plenty of sadness, but there were also moments of gratitude and kindness.
And yes, and reaching out to others. Yeah. Great lesson. So folks, we've had another episode of Stories for Healing. I hope it touched you as it touched me. I want to remind you that this is something we do every weekday at 2:30 in the afternoon, East Coast time in the United States. We also, you can come back if you've missed these videos back to this same Facebook page or to the YouTube page, YouTube playlist that's listed at the top of this page. And you can watch them then. Watch them over and over, see the ones you missed, whatever it is. We'll be doing this for quite some time to come, I'm sure, because I think there's both uh, a real interest in that from so many of you, and also a real desire on the part of storytellers to tell these stories. So please be sure to listen up, to listen to them and share them. But even more importantly, be ready to tell and to hear stories from each other with an open heart and with an open hand, ready to help out in these difficult times. Thanks again. Bye-bye.